Maybe press on to Jenny. Do you think you could
I can indeed.
serve up a boiled version of having been door knocking for X weeks? What was it like out there?
And I do want to warn people that some of this doesn't sound positive, but it is, because all the information that we have is positive, because we can use that and we can work on it, and there are positive points in this, and I do think it does actually bode well for the future. I think this was a very unique election where there were a lot of undercurrents and obviously a huge economic situation that just dwarfed every other issue. Obviously, with door knocking, the first thing anybody would ever comment about was the economy. It did absolutely dwarf everything else. The positive part of this is that when you actually talk to people about projects such as insulation of homes and schools and the fact that these would create jobs and these would save people money, the general public are very, very positive about that kind of project. So it does bode well for the future, and they are also very positive about large-scale wind production, for example, particularly when it's offshore. It gets a little bit more contentious when it's sort of possibly in their back garden, but they like the idea of it. The only thing that slightly concerns me is that there's a very strong pro-nuclear undercurrent. For the people that are aware of the problem, they say yes, but people won't change. We need to keep the lights going on, and there's a very strong nuclear angle. So that if you're happy with nuclear power, that might not be a problem for you, but if that's a concern of yours, then that's something that you may well have to be aware of over the next year. A lot of people are heading towards the nuclear side of things. They see it as no other choice. People are talking about climate change to a certain extent on the door, but they are lacking a comprehension of the actual situation. And if anything, I think unfortunately that has almost gone backwards over the last year. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But one of the things that I do think was concerning, and one of the things that we would have to address over the next year, is how often immigration came up as an issue with regards to climate change and with protecting our environment. Because I hadn't seen this before in any other election, but it did come out, and it wasn't coming out in the usual suspect areas of the council estates and the general sort of skinhead thug type thing. This was middle-class white families saying, well, yes, but we're having to build all of these houses and we're having to build all of these because of an immigration problem. So I think that that's something that we need to be aware of, and that population issue as a whole is actually coming up on the doorsteps. I've never ever had that before. So that's new, and we do have to address that moving forward. As I said, climate change is being mentioned. It's not being mentioned as much as I would have liked it to be. I think this is because it's fallen out of the so-called worry pool. There's, generally speaking, psychiatrists believe that there's about 5 or 6 things of sort of national interest that we can worry about at any one time. Because the environment had become such a huge issue, and because Copenhagen had been some time past for a lot of people that aren't involved in the movement, so to speak, the environment had kind of almost fallen out of the worry pool. And I think to a lot of people it was still seen as an either or of, well, yes, the environment's a nice thing that we like to do when things are prosperous, and of course we like our parks and all these kinds of things, but right now the economy is up the creek, and people aren't necessarily relating the two to each other and don't realise that actually fixing the two together is the best way forward, and we need to work on actually bringing that forward. One of the other things that I've noticed is the so-called sort of other side of the debate. I don't believe there are actually two sides of the climate change debate. I don't think there have been for years, but the general public do still feel that there are two sides to this, have been making an awful lot of noise, and very particularly in Swindon as well. I was talking to earlier, and I said the only leaflet I got through my door that actually mentioned climate change was one from UKIP denying it. And you know, I did have Green Party candidates, so I did have other Green Party literature in my house, but that was the only one that I actually got, and I think that shows just how far it had actually fallen out of people's day-to-day concerns. I think possibly because the UKIP vote is doubled this time, we may actually now need to be moving on and actually addressing their issues and correcting misinformation, because misinformation is out there, and it is out there very profoundly.
What sort of misinformation? Just to be explicit, I'm sure we all have ideas.
1992 was the hottest year on record. That was actually the one that was mentioned in the UKIP leaflet, that tended to come out. And again, I think with the worry pool, people tend to concentrate on worrying about things that they feel they can have a control over, whereas climate change, they don't completely understand, and they certainly don't feel that they can control it. So it's one of those easiest things just to say, oh, but it could be nonsense, so let's stop worrying about that for a while. It was very, very easy for people to drop.
Did the Copenhagen email thing register, or is that just me being middle class intelligentsia?
It tended to be, I'm not sure, because I knocked on people's doors with a great big green rosette, but people kind of thought I was already sort of, they knew that I understood the issues. So it may be that other candidates would have got a much harder time about climate change, and may have been talked to a lot more about it than I would have been. And I wouldn't say that people aren't concerned, because when you talk to them about what they're doing, they are doing things. They are recycling. They are trying to reduce the driving, and they are very positive about projects, such as if somebody said to them, would you have solar panels on your house if you could just pay back a little bit each month with the money that you save from electricity? They'd say, yes, I want to do that, and I want to do this. So they are positive about the future, and they are doing the things like recycling, and they are doing a lot of these things. They do understand the bigger picture, but they don't necessarily relate it to climate change, which I thought was interesting, because for me, it sort of the climate change thing led to everything else, whereas other people sort of recycle automatically and try to do other things without necessarily related it to climate change. So that was an interesting learning thing for me. And one of the other things we have to argue against as well is we have to be careful to pretend we're not, to not come across as perfect. Because we would have people on the door saying, oh, well, yes, I'm sure you buy all organic things, but that's flown in from goodness knows where. And I said, well, actually, happens a lot of local things. And it's like, oh, well, what about all the poor farmers in Africa? And these kind of things. And we have to be careful not to get bogged down in it, because in my experience, this tends to come from people who are buying things that are flown in from goodness knows where and aren't organic and just don't care, and they're just trying to wind you up about it. But on the other hand, we do have to point out, yes, there are choices, but let's try to make these carefully. No, we're not saying anybody's perfect, and we're certainly not saying we're perfect. And I think the sort of the climate gate side of things, opening that up as well, I think there was a lot of things that, well, those scientists weren't nice people in some of the things that they said, but we never said that they were, we just said that the science was true. And I think we do have to be careful not to portray ourselves as sort of gods of the earth, and we're doing everything right, because it's very easy to be pulled back on that, and none of us are perfect. So we do have to come back into that. But I did want to end on a really positive note, and there are a lot of positive notes, and I hope people have picked those up in the things I was saying, that people are actually doing things and they are positive for the future. There are just some things that we do need to be addressed. One, people aren't necessarily talking about it as a whole. The young are. And they are very much. They're coming through school very well educated on the issues. They know exactly what's going on. They're very positive about the possible job creation in the future out of this. They know their livelihoods depend on this. And they do care very much. And also, I know I said I talk about doorsteps, but you can't help but talk about virtual world. I got more emails about climate change from people than anything else. The second was nuclear power. So I thought that was worthy of note, that email campaigns are getting out there. I just possibly knocked on the wrong doors. So you never know. I did knock on an awful lot of doors, but the people that are engaged, that definitely are going to go out and vote, that are actually emailing people, are asking those questions. And the fact that you do generally get to tick lots of boxes of who you want to email, and they were even bothering to copy the email, even though they probably knew what I was going to say, or knew that I was going to agree with them, they were still keeping me in on that loop, and there were a few emails. So, you know, there is a lot of work with them. I think I really do as well.